Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of James. We're still in James chapter 1, today looking at verses 13 through 15. Now, earlier in chapter 1, James had been talking about when we go through times of trial and times of testing. And he's told us there's a blessing in such times because our faith grows. And as it grows and matures, we receive the fullness of the crown of life that God promises to those who are His. Now, as he moves into verse 13, he sort of changes gears just a little bit. He's been talking about times of testing, times of trial, and that leads him to think about times of temptation, which are different. A time of testing, a time of trial is a little different from a time of temptation. A trial or a test may just be a difficult moment in which your faith is pushed and you grow in your faith. But a time of temptation is when you are enticed or lured by the possibility of sin. You're tempted to sin. That's different from a testing. Now, obviously a temptation is a testing, but you understand the distinction we're making here. A time of testing, a time of trial comes from circumstances, but a temptation particularly is an enticement to sin. And so his discussion about testing times leads him to think about temptation. And so he has a very careful word to say about when temptation comes to us. So verses 13 through 15. Now when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desires and enticed. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Now notice James begins by saying that temptation does not come from God. No one should say, when they are undergoing temptation, that God is tempting me. That is to ascribe evil to God. You see, temptation, as James is discussing here, temptation is an enticement or a lure to commit sin, and God lures no one to sin. God himself does no evil. He cannot be tempted by evil, and so he never tempts his children. It may have been that some were implying that, and James had heard some Christians were thinking, well, maybe God sets this up for me so that I can overcome sin. No. God does not tempt his children. He does not entice his children to sin. So don't make the mistake of saying that God tempts you. Now you might hear someone say, God allowed me to be tempted. And I suppose that would be true in the sense that God allows you free will. And God allows you to freely choose. And that provides an opportunity for temptation to come. When something evil tries to get you to use your free will to disobey the commands of God. So in that sense, God allows it to happen in that he has made you a free creature who could choose that. But that is a far different thing from saying that God himself is tempting you. God does not tempt to evil. Well, where does temptation come from? Where does temptation arise from? Well, James is ready to begin discussing that. He says, temptation comes when we are dragged away by our evil desires. In other words, when the desires of our heart become twisted or tuned toward evil, that can lead to the possibility of temptation, which raises the possibility we might be led into sin. Now, we need to discuss carefully how desires can become evil. Because a desire in itself is not evil, but it can become evil when it's twisted or distorted by temptation. But we'll talk about that tomorrow. So join us in our next 5-minute Bible study in the book of James. And we'll talk about how desires can become twisted and lead to temptation. So I'll see you next time for our 5-minute Bible study in this wonderful little book of James.